Well, good evening, friends, and welcome to the 26th Benjamin Eby Lecture at Conrad Grebel University College. I'm Jim Pankratz, Dean of the College, and I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of President Susan Schultz Huxman and the faculty of the college. A special welcome to Susan's family, her parents Harold and Carolyn Schultz, and her husband Jesse. This is a very special event. The Benjamin Eby Lecture Series was established in 1981 as a forum for the Grebel faculty to present their research and their creativity to this community. And what a rich feast of ideas and insights we've had since then. Your program introduces you to Benjamin Eby, after whom this lecture series is named, and you're going to hear more about him in the lecture this evening. The college faculty and I are pleased that this year's Eby lecturer is our faculty colleague and college president, Susan Schultz Huxman. As we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Conrad Grebel University College, it's fitting that she is speaking for us and to us this evening. She embodies our college mission. Susan's had a very successful career as a teacher and a scholar of rhetoric and communication, an educational leader and administrator, and an engaged citizen. She's paid particular attention to the voices of the marginalized, women seeking rights and dignity, pacifists standing firmly against war, civil rights advocates demanding that nations live up to their declared high ideals. And Susan loves teaching. Since she came to Grebel as president just over 2 years ago, she's already taught 2 graduate courses in 2 different programs. Her course in our Theological Studies program was about communicating our message in times of transition and crisis. Her course in our graduate Peace and Conflict Studies program was on leadership and crisis communication. Her students were enthusiastic about her teaching, her passion, clarity, energy, breadth and depth of insight, and above all, her deep interest in them. So please join me as we welcome Grebel President Susan Schultz Huxman to deliver the 2013 Benjamin Eby Lecture.
Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this evening, and thank you, Jim, for your remarks. As a seasoned academic dean, Jim knows how to be attentive to what we are doing as faculty and staff, what our projects are. He listens to our new discoveries and supports our many projects and pursuits. So thanks again, my friend. Well, tonight, as you heard, Jim, is the 26th occasion of the Benjamin Eby Lecture Series, first inaugurated under President Ralph Liebold in 1981. According to the first program, the lecture series was designed to be a fertile seedbed of scholarship and stimulating thought, and to deal with academic issues within an explicitly Christian framework. The first Eby lecture speaker was Grebel's first chaplain and professor of religious studies, Walter Clausen. He, from Saskatchewan, an Oxford PhD, who had come from Kansas after serving 4 years at Bethel College. In the introduction of his lecture, entitled "The University, the Temple of Intellect, Past and Present," Walter said the occasion for his remarks were challenging, partly because he was giving the first one, partly because he said he couldn't do justice to his topic in the time allotted. He said, reflecting on the university, its place and function, is a bit like trying to dip water with a sieve. An added challenge tonight is that the event is not only an academic lecture, but also branded as one of our 50 events for 50 years. It's to be celebratory and inspirational. So I think it's fitting that for me, as a scholar who likes to study rhetorical hybrids, the blending of occasions, speech forms, and audience expectations, that this is one of those bifurcated events, part academic lecture, part motivational, community-building kinds of exercises. And I used to tell my students, think of me as a platypus. Part duck, part beaver. I like to study rhetorical forms that are not that predictable, speech occasions that are unstable, unusual, even peculiar, like the strange aquatic creature, the platypus. And further, I think it is fitting that as one who likes to study rhetorical underdogs, individuals who, despite long odds, manage to survive and thrive and win the argument, this lecture series is named after Benjamin Eby. Eby, as many of you know, was a real mover and shaker in Waterloo County in the early 1800s. So much so, they called the place Ebytown for a while. Now you may say, well, Eby doesn't sound much like an underdog to me, until you discover that he defied expectations. At 5 foot 5 inches tall and around 145 pounds, Benjamin Eby was a very slight man. He was told by family and friends, "You will never make it as a farmer. You are simply not strong or large enough." Well, of course, we know that, of course, Benjamin Eby did make it as a farmer, a very successful farmer. He also made it as a Mennonite bishop, a teacher, an author, a city leader, a musician, a community builder, and I don't know, perhaps he even served as dog catcher. He truly punched above his weight. In many ways, Eby himself was a profile of rhetorical courage for church and society. But lest you get the wrong idea, my message does not profile Benjamin Eby. But it does profile some other notable speakers who directly or indirectly speak to the kind of institution of higher learning Conrad Grebel has aspired to be for 50 years. I want to begin by telling you a story. A shortened version of Robert Munsch's The Paper Bag Princess. Elizabeth was a beautiful princess. She lived in a castle and had expensive princess clothes. She was going to marry a prince named Ronald. Unfortunately, a dragon smashed her castle, burned all her clothes with his fiery breath, and carried off Prince Ronald. Elizabeth decided to chase the dragon and get Ronald back. She looked everywhere for something to wear, but the only thing she could find that was not burnt was a paper bag. So she put on the paper bag and followed the dragon. Elizabeth was able to outsmart the dragon by having him show her all his amazing skills. And finally, the dragon was so tired, he didn't even move. Elizabeth walked right over the dragon and opened the door to the cave. There was Prince Ronald. He looked at her and said, "Elizabeth, you are a mess. You smell like ashes. Your hair is all tangled, and you are wearing an old, dirty paper bag. Come back when you are dressed like a real princess." "Ronald," said Elizabeth, "your clothes are really pretty, and your hair is very neat. You look like a real prince, but you are a bum." They didn't get married, after all. So why did I tell this story? Is it because Munsch is a Canadian author? The story is entertaining. The story's archetypal theme speaks to the human condition. It's a wicked example of parody. Feminists identify with it. The story subverts the normal order of things. Well, of course, the answer is all of the above. I use this story in a rhetoric course sometimes I teach to elicit discussion on the power of utilizing a recognizable form, a fairy tale, with an ageless message, do not be deceived by appearances, to teach a rather radical, subversive message. Women can be heroes, first responders, rescuers, and be successful on their own terms. This contemporary children's story illustrates the rhetorical principles that have guided my scholarship in the communication discipline for over 25 years. And they're really three, and they're interlocking. The power of stories and the intersection of the rhetorical and literary traditions, the invitational quality of rhetoric and the paradox of identification, and the brazenness of subversive discourse and the study of rhetorical underdogs. So tonight I want to explore these three guiding principles that have fascinated me for a very long time and that emanate from rich, complex rhetorical acts, speeches that far exceed the challenges of the paper bag princess, even as they trade on its techniques. So, to the power of stories, let me tell you a story. That simple line triggers rapt attention from young and old alike. Storytelling has been the principal means by which we have entertained one another, inspired one another, taught one another, persuaded one another from the beginning of time. We are indeed creatures of story. Rhetorical theorist Walt Fisher calls us homo narrans, the storytelling animal. Isaac Denison, the great Danish storyteller, said, "To be a person is to have a story to tell." The great spiritual leaders of the world, Jesus included, taught in stories, not bulleted points or pie charts. Stories transcend culture, time, and circumstances. Story, like music, is the universal language. So, we like stories, but what can they do for us? First, stories empower, sustain, and connect us to one another. They're like piecing and stitching in a quilt. Stories secure a bond from one generation to the next. Ernst Cassirer, the noted German philosopher, said, "Stories are our societal glue." There is an ancient African proverb, if you inherit land, you have to farm it. If you inherit a story, you have to tell it. It's a great saying because it reminds us that the storyteller has an obligation to pass on culture, character, and identity. Second, stories are enormously comforting. They follow a pattern we all know. Stories begin with a reassuring invitation. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, in the beginning, and it came to pass. The scene is set, characters are introduced, conflict and suspense develops, rising action and resolution. Children as young as 2 recognize this form. Third, in terms of organizational communication, storytelling is the most powerful way that we can do 3 things: pass on institutional memory, avoid mission drift, and humanize your operations. Many methods of persuasion are what we call push strategies. We can be bombarded by numbers and cold logic. Story, by contrast, is a pull strategy, an invitation to engage an audience on its own terms. At Grebel, we engage in all manner of gentle pull strategies in storytelling to build community and affirm our identity. The Grebel vision story, of which there are many versions, is especially inspirational. Both the story of Conrad Grebel and Harvey Taves and others are critical, visionary, foundational stories, versions of which are told in the Grebel anniversary book, Bridging Mind and Spirit, Conrad Grebel, 1963 to 2013. A book that can be yours for only $25 or $1,000. And if you want to know why we would have those two very different kinds of pay scales, let me tell you a story after this presentation, why the $1,000 check is actually a better deal to get this book. That's another story. The Conrad Grebel story has been told many, many times in Grebel's 50 years. It was even told in the very first EB lecture. Walter Clausen told this version of the Conrad Grebel story, and I quote, "Conrad Grebel College is named after a young humanist scholar who as a student wasted his time, wasted his money, and wasted his health, and finally became a dropout. He did, however, get an education, and he knew how to think. Although he wrote poetry in Greek, he was not especially brilliant, and he would have long been forgotten were it not for the fact that he and his friends proposed a radical new model for the relationship of church and state, and then acted upon it." End of quote. Our students in residence, many of whom are not Mennonite, are attracted and empowered by the story of Conrad Grebel. Especially this year, as one of our staff, Eric Lepp, looks the part of young Conrad, has a great costume, and has played the role at community supper. Fast forward 4 centuries. The Grebel story takes root in the form of a college along Westmount Road in Waterloo, Ontario. Several courageous and visionary founders, including Norman High, Harvey Taves, and Milton Good, devised the audacious plan that I'm sure sent many Mennonites reeling. Last year, at our larger leadership team retreat for Grebel students, we told the story of Harvey Taves, one of the founders of Conrad Grebel University College. Harvey is right here, very tall man. Milton Good is right next to him, and this is the first president, Winfield Fretz. This is the first board meeting at Conrad Grebel. But I want to tell the story of Harvey Taves. Here was a man, before his untimely death at the age of 39, worked tirelessly and patiently for 6 years in the late 1950s to get the Mennonites in Ontario to embrace the idea of starting a Mennonite college on a secular university campus. Detractors on the right dismissed the idea of a Mennonite college as too worldly or too expensive. Detractors on the left, many with ties to Goshen College in Indiana, dismissed the idea because a Waterloo campus would compete with Goshen for students and donors. To quote a leading U.S. Mennonite theologian of the day, "There would be too few qualified academics in Canada to do the job right." Ouch. Taves was not to be outdone. He was a master of diplomacy. Unlike Benjamin Eby, Taves was a towering man, which may have been an advantage in navigating between church factions. Without being dismissive or discouraged with either of these formidable blocks of naysayers, Taves worked quietly behind the scenes to line up support. Shortly before Grebel's charter was finally granted in 1961, Taves wrote this: "One thing seems absolutely certain to me, and that is that the young person who maintains his faith in the face of opposition is in a much better position to represent that faith once he enters professional life. And for this reason, starting a Mennonite college that is affiliated with the University of Waterloo is worth the risk." Worth the risk indeed. How visionary. So these are just 2 of Grebel's foundational stories that speak to who we are and why we matter. But another question people ask of institutional leaders is, why are you here? And because my father is here this evening, I must tell at least one. I would not be here were it not for my dad's Canada Connection story. So here goes. One reason I am here today is my dad was granted special permission as a non-Mennonite at the time to enroll as a transfer student in grade 10 at Rockway Mennonite Collegiate in Kitchener, Ontario in 1947. His dad, my grandfather, A.J. Schultz, was a well-known Baptist minister. Some said a spellbinding storyteller. In Kitchener, in Guelph, and New Hamburg, Ontario, these were places that he lived and worked, among many others. My grandfather Schultz was a pacifist and had served on the mission fields in Africa with Mennonites. Rockway granted the special admission that allowed my dad to attend Rockway. Well, my dad had a very persuasive good friend, Bill Clausen, who after he graduated from Rockway said, "Schultzy, you don't want to go to Waterloo Lutheran? Come to Goshen with me." And so as fate would have it, my dad took a night train to check out this Goshen College in the United States. There he met my mother, a good, smart Swiss Menno from Holmes County, Ohio, who could play basketball and debate, cook and sew, and the rest, as they say, is history. So stories are powerful resources. In short, one of the best ways that I can function publicly as Grebel's president is to enact my own scholarly sensibilities, to pass on Grebel stories, stories that empower and sustain us, stories that sometimes challenge us, stories that comfort us, and ultimately celebrate our mission to seek wisdom, nurture faith, and pursue peace in service to church and society. My second area of study is called the invitational quality of rhetoric and the pivotal role of identification. I'm sure many of you remember Robert Frost's poem, The Pasture. It is, of course, a wonderful example of the appeal of invitation. The first stanza reads, "I'm going out to clear the pasture spring. I'll only stop to rake the leaves away, and wait to watch the water clear, I may. I shan't be gone long. You come too." Frost often chose to lead off his public readings with The Pasture as a way of introducing himself and inviting the audience to come along on his journey, a purpose for which the poem is perfectly suited, because that's what it is, an intimate invitation. Rhetoric, too, at its best, is invitational, a kind of you come to and join my persuasive opening. So if you want to accept my ideas, then I need to socialize my reasons. And that leads us to the pivotal term of rhetoric, identification. The leading rhetorical theorist of the 20th century, Kenneth Burke, established an entire theoretical system around this paradoxical term, identification. Identification is paradoxical because it has two opposite meanings. It means, first of all, to be distinct, separate, unique, or different. In the advertising world, we understand this term in the phrase branding. Products and services and universities need to differentiate themselves from the cluttered marketplace. They need to stand out in the crowd. And so this is one meaning of identification, to be different, to be separate. The second meaning of identification is to be similar, belonging to, unifying with. If I say I want to identify with my audience, it means I want to relate to you, your values, your experiences. It is the most fundamental element of persuasion. In the world of politics, at its crudest level, we understand this term in ways in which politicians kiss babies and say they are the family values candidate. Rhetoric functions at the intersection of segregation and congregation. As a current provocative example, the proposed Quebec Charter of Values, which would have Quebec's public sector employees bar them from wearing conspicuous religious symbols. This is a debate which is really all about this double meaning of identification. Its supporters are really charting a turbulent course between segregation and congregation. Opponents of the value charter, often adopting the more comedic strategy of humor, have shown the absurdity of some of these strained efforts to narrow provincial identity. Even businesses are getting into the act. Here is an ad for attracting Quebec physicians to Ontario saying, look, if Quebec doesn't want a big tent of religious diversity, other provinces don't mind. As this particular medical facility says, we don't care what's on your head, we care what's in it. Gary Woodward, a rhetorical theorist and author of the book The Idea of Identification, writes that Quebec has always been a special and peculiar case study in the push and pull of identity rhetorics. Of course, lest we think this is all very silly, the idea of restricting religious head coverings in public, remember the reason for why the Sterling Mennonite Church exists today. And if you don't know that story, I'd be happy to share that one with you later. I want to share with you a very powerful example of the way identification was used in an extraordinarily inventive way in one of America's darkest hours. It concerns the tragic and senseless death of Martin Luther King and how the news of his death was communicated by Robert F. Kennedy on one of his campaign stops in Indianapolis. So let me tell you that story. 1 hour after Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, Robert F. Kennedy, then a presidential contender campaigning in Indianapolis, received the grim news. Kennedy scuttled his scheduled campaign speech in the heart of the city, resisted the advice from the police and his own handlers to get the heck out of Dodge, walked into the ghetto of that city alone, called out for people to follow him, climbed in the back of a pickup, and in the cold night with a howling wind, delivered an impromptu speech to an audience of around 1,000 mostly black citizens who had no idea Martin Luther King was dead. Here's how he began. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm only going to speak to you for 1 or 2 minutes tonight because I have sad news. I have sad news for you, for all our fellow citizens, and for the people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. And at this point, we have good video evidence to support this. There were screams, wailing, just the rawest, most visceral sound of pain that a human voice can summon. And as the screams died down, Kennedy resumed slowly, pausing frequently, measuring his words, and at the very end of his remarks, he says, "For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and distrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I can only say that I feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my own family killed. He was killed by a white man." This is the first time that Robert Kennedy had publicly spoken of the death of his brother, John F. Kennedy. And given that his audience knew that Bobby and Martin Luther King were very, very close friends, these points of identification, born out of tragic circumstances, made his words and his plea for peace especially credible. He ends, "We have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote, 'Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the human heart until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the grace of God. He closed by saying, "Let us dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and to say a prayer for our country and for our people." Here's the remarkable thing, besides the fact this was an impromptu speech, blows me away. Over the next few days, there were riots in 76 American cities. 46 people died. 2,500 were injured. 28,000 were jailed. Indianapolis remained quiet. This is the opening story I tell the students in my book, The Rhetorical Act, Thinking, Speaking, and Writing Critically, to illustrate the power of identification. The third related area of my scholarly inquiry is the brazenness of subversive discourse and the study of rhetorical underdogs. Well, let's start with something very simple here. We all like underdogs. If you were a kid in the 60s, you may even remember the cartoon series Underdog. I do. And of course, how many archetypal stories feature a come-from-behind winner, like the tortoise and the hare story? Even the well-known biblical story of David and Goliath encourages us to root for the underdog. Malcolm Gladwell, the celebrated Canadian writer who is a columnist for The New Yorker and has many bestsellers, The Tipping Point and Outliers among them, is on a recent cover of Maclean's magazine promoting his new book, appropriately titled David and Goliath. And it is a collection of case studies and stories that promote the secret power of the underdog. I have studied many rhetorical underdogs, from the early women's rights movement, the anti-slavery movement, the civil rights movement, and the peace movement, including such folks as Angelina Grimke, Carrie Chapman Catt, Anna Howard Shaw, Mary Wollstonecraft, Margaret Fuller, Jeanette Rankin, and Ida B. Wells, to name a few. What makes these advocates rhetorical underdogs is the following. They are no-name rhetoricians who defy the odds, who overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges and win. They exist at the margins of society. They try to empower others at the margins, what we call exercising rhetorical agency, a whole other topic. And most significantly, because they are at the margins and have little to lose, they engage in a risky venture called subversive discourse. So what is subversion? Well, it gets a bad rap sometimes. It's not defined as the sinister anarchist overthrow of a government, though in its malevolent extremes, of course, it can become that. Rather, subversion is best defined as non-conformity or counterculture. In rhetorical terms, subversion is one of the four principal motives of all communication. There's affirmation and reaffirmation, purification, and subversion. Subversion is really the undermining of a prevailing idea. It is crafting normative disruption. Only through symbolic reversals can consciousness be raised and received wisdom be turned upside down. By this definition, even my life has been called subversive. I took some satisfaction in being called the subversive 10% by the Chronicle of Higher Education. In 2009, a feature research expose unveiled the presence of precious outliers, women in academia who are married with more than 2 children, are serving as administrators, and have found ways to become tenured and promoted in publish or perish research institutions. Yes, only 10%. Well, I study subversive rhetors of a far more noble sort, those who speak truth to power and show great courage in impacting social change and religious faithfulness. My first brazen and subversive underdog story is about a woman named Angelina Grimke, one of my very first research projects. What an unlikely reformer she was. Born into privilege in 1805 in Charleston, South Carolina, to a wealthy slaveholding family, Angelina had every comfort imaginable. She was the youngest of 14 kids, educated by private tutors, raised as a devout Episcopalian, doted on by her parents and siblings, and yet she was restive. She and her older sister Sarah, Angelina is the one in the front in the dark hair, Sarah the one in the back, the two of them were particularly disturbed by the practice of slavery. So even though the laws of South Carolina forbade teaching slaves to read and write, the sisters created an underground school on their own plantation. Grimke's diary describes these sessions with supreme satisfaction. The light was put out, the keyhole screened, and flat on our stomachs with the spelling book under our eyes, we defied the laws of South Carolina. The girls were discovered by their father and severely lectured. But rather than give up and be dutiful children, they ran away, took up residence in Philadelphia, joined the Quakers and the anti-slavery cause. Here in 1836, at the age of 31, Angelina published a letter entitled Appeal to the Christian Women of the South, wherein she urged Southern women to do the unthinkable, to persuade your husband, fathers and brothers and sons that slavery is a crime against God and man. That line was considered heretical. As pamphlets were disseminated in South Carolina, the Charleston authorities warned Angelina that should she ever come back, she would be arrested in her hometown, and the postmaster burned copies of the letter. But it was a hot May evening in Philadelphia in 1838, which became Angelina's swan song in her struggle for human rights. 2 days after her marriage to a fellow reformer in the anti-slavery cause, Angelina accepted an invitation to speak at the dedication of Pennsylvania Hall, a splendid gaslit structure with the motto, Virtue, Liberty, and Independence in gold letters across the stage. In publicity leading up to the event, she was denounced in the papers by the Massachusetts clergy as a godless woman, a he-woman, even the devil incarnate. Before the ceremonies could even unfold, an angry, howling mob formed in the streets. When a black woman, Maria Mitchell, got up to introduce Angelina Grimke, the crowd inside booed and hollered, and the mob outside threw bricks and rotten tomatoes right through the window. Mitchell fainted, and the crowd erupted in laughter and ridicule. Calmly, Angelina Grimke arose from her seat. She was a large woman, over 6 foot tall, gazed around the large hall with such unnerving intensity, the crowd momentarily silenced, and she began, in an unconventional way, by challenging her audience's presence, something that we never teach in public speaking. Men, brethren, fathers, mothers, daughters, and sisters, what came ye out for to see? A reed shaken in the wind? Is it curiosity merely, or a deep sympathy with the perishing slave? At that, someone yelled, "Fire!" People ran. Heavy stones thudded against the windows. Angelina Grimke kept on speaking. She continued, this time by scolding her audience, turning the tables, appropriating the words of Jesus, and adopting a radical prophet persona, all entirely subversive strategies, especially for women. This is a small sample of how she continued. Deluded beings, they know not what they do. Do you ask, what has the North to do with slavery? Hear it, hear it. Those voices without tell us that the spirit of slavery is here. At this, shouting and stones are thrown against the window again. Amidst the hostile crowd, Angelina spoke for well over an hour. Later that evening, the mob burned down the hall. That's what you see here. This is Pennsylvania Hall burning down. Speaking truth to power is dangerous business. Ill health forced Angelina to retire shortly after this impassioned radical speech. Though she raised 3 children, she was bedridden for years. Still, what a debt of gratitude that we owe this moral voice who dared to speak truth to power on behalf of women and slaves even 30 years before the Civil War. My final story this evening features a rhetorical medley, a real platypus case, if you will, of all 3 of my scholarly interests. It is at once subversive, speaking truth to power in ways that disrupt, provoke, and confound. It is at the same time an exemplar case of the paradox of identification, an unusual rendering of the warp and woof of segregation and congregation. And on top of all that, it remains a riveting underdog story that teaches a nonconformist way to preserve a group's identity in the midst of tumult and crisis. I'm talking about the Mennonites and the way in which this quiet-in-the-land people launched a rather sophisticated public relations campaign to defend themselves in World War I. I'd like to share with you briefly some inspiring examples of self-defense rhetoric from Mennonite apologists, specifically from the Mennonite crisis of citizenship in the U.S. during the Great War between the year 1917 and 1918. From these men and women of faith, we see real, unusual, countercultural apologia. You see, Mennonites chose a very different approach to crisis and managing crisis, one that does not seek to respond to accusation by peddling in manipulation for the purpose of winning. In that sense, it is truly a nonconformist, subversive approach to repairing an image, akin to how Jesus plays the exemplar apologist in John 8. The story in John 8 is a common rhetorical pattern for how Jesus responds to challenges from skeptics throughout the New Testament, encounter after encounter with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and with Pilate. Jesus turns the tables on challenges by his accusers. In the particular instance of the adulteress parable in John 8, Jesus' defense utilizes the resources of paradox. It is at once engaging and disengaging. He stands up to address the Jewish leaders, but not before a long pause, where he stooped over drawing in the sand, and he returns to that pose. He affirms the law, yet challenges the law. Yes, stone her, but only you who is without sin may throw the first. It is a disarming lesson that bewilders and embarrasses. His accusers slipped away one by one. Well, you might say, well, how in the world did Mennonites use this as a kind of recipe for handling charges that they were un-American for not fighting a war to save democracy? I mean, their rhetorical challenge was immense. They had 3 strikes against them. Strike 1. This was the mother of all wars. There was no escape. National conscription was passed into law in the United States for the first time ever. Strike 2. America discovered the power of propaganda. This war used advertising to create an intense, unifying militaristic patriotism for which there was no comparison. Buy liberty bonds for wife and child, for hearth and home, for freedom and safety. Who could resist that? Fly the American flag, contribute to the American Red Cross, the greatest mother in the world. Support Uncle Sam, enlist today, speak the American language. Yes, the post office warning said, speak the American language, not the English language. And if you don't do these kinds of things, you're a coward, a slacker, a parasite, and especially pro-German. The nation's newspapers hurled this vitriol often. On the one page, you see a clip from the Detroit Free Press. German Americans, hyphenated Americans, were simply not wanted. The other from the Cleveland Plain Dealers, Slackers Row, and you see the cowards there knitting. These were to be like Mennonites, the religious, conscientious objectors who did not want to fight. So that was the second strike against them. The third strike against them was that Mennonites were not known as charismatic leaders, savvy public relations people, or shrewd lobbyists. They were, after all, referred to as the quiet in the land. Mennonite pastors even said, "We do not have gifts for this kind of thing." Usually, it's 3 strikes and you're out. And yet Mennonites were not quite out. Remarkably, they did not adopt the 2 responses typical of their heritage when under attack: flee or stoically endure persecution. How did they respond then to the accusations that they were cowards, slackers, pro-German? How did they respond to the threats of physical violence in their home communities, to strong-arm tactics by local governments bent on arresting them for violating the Espionage and Sedition Acts? First, Mennonites formed a lobby on Capitol Hill within 2 weeks of America's entrance into the war. This was a shocking departure from their low-profile, apolitical role of their forebears, a disarming response, really. These Mennonite apologists abandoned their insular, low-profile position and besieged Washington with letters and petitions pleading for the legal acknowledgement of religious, conscientious objection. Second, these Mennonite apologists adopted a shrewd sense of place, understanding how to diffuse conflict by where they engaged their accusers. They negotiated a clever strategy to diffuse the conflict with local government officials by encouraging all Mennonite boys to register and report to camp, even though no provisions had been made in 1917 for non-combatant service. Mennonites might have refused to enter a military system that had no definite policy for non-resistors, but Mennonite men and boys mostly did report to camp. Third, Mennonites waged a rhetorical battle on 2 fronts to preserve their double identity as Americans and as Mennonites. This both-and response to crisis was complicated and confounding. They used the church press to show members of the faith how to remain faithful Mennonites in the face of unrelenting pressure to conform to the American war effort. They published pocket-sized tracts of biblical passages of non-resistance for drafted men to memorize, carry in their wallets, and to use at draft boards. This one in particular, published by Scottsdale Mennonite Press, is all about the tenets of non-resistance. There are 10 key Bible passages about non-resistance, and on the page that is particularly difficult to see, there is testimony from noted warriors on the evil of war. So they had this as part of their identifying mission, and they said things such as, "It is better to die a martyr's death than give up our faith in biblical non-resistance." But they also used the church press to show members of the faith how to be loyal Americans in these difficult times, how to contribute to the Red Cross. These are Mennonite women in Newton, Kansas at the railroad station, contributing in the Red Cross effort. They also used the church press to say why it was important in some places to stop speaking German and even to stop publishing the Der Herald German newspaper in Kansas. In this particular instance, there were very few illustrations in Der Herald, and this one, when I came across it, was just amazed. It says Patriots at the bottom, and of course you see the big burly farmer carrying the bag of wheat, a Mennonite farmer, and in the bubble you see the picture of the Revolutionary warrior with the musket, and the idea is, of course, that as a farmer, as a Mennonite farmer in sowing seed, you were a patriot too, just as the person on the battlefield. They said things such as, we realize that it is difficult for the government to deal with people like us. Since we cannot serve in the armed forces, we can help our country in so many other ways. These contrasting rhetorical responses, one seeking separation, the other assimilation, come together in a most paradoxical way. When some Mennonite men who reported to a camp agreed to wear the uniform, agreed to march under a drill sergeant, but carry brooms and not guns. These are all Mennonite men in an army camp in Kansas called, ironically, Camp Funston. And they are marching, but they are not carrying guns. It is truly one of my favorite pieces. It is remarkably inventive, invitational, paradoxical, and most certainly subversive. Here's a story of conviction and courage from the World War I defense that puts the Mennonite nonconformist stance in sharp perspective. It's been called the flag story, and it features a Mennonite minister and a farmer from Whitewater, Kansas, named Bernard Harder. And here he is with his wife. The story takes place on the Bernard Harder farm near Whitewater, Kansas, a rural farming community in April 1918, at the height of U.S. involvement in World War I. A mob decided to go to the home of Bernard Harder, a local Mennonite minister, and force him to put up a flag. Harder received the tip that this disgruntled group was coming. He strode out to meet the group on the steps of his porch after watching the parade of local citizens make the way up his property. The mob angrily demanded that he put up an American flag. Harder agreed. Then he asked some technical questions about the proper way to mount and fly the flag. Did anyone bring a flagpole? No. Well, if you fly a flag, doesn't it need to be properly cared for? You know, taken down each night. One man from the group, clearly irritated by the delay, said, just hang it with nails. Harder said, won't the flag rip off in the Kansas wind? The reply, it doesn't matter. So the flag was mounted on the rafters of the porch with nails. Then one man shouted, let's sing America. Harder readily joined in. In fact, he continued to sing the other verses of the song. Since the mob knew the words of only the first verse, he was the only person singing all 4 verses. Subdued, the mob retreated from his property. I think you can see the lessons from the flag story. The flag story disarms the opposition in much the way Jesus' story with the adulteress does. Just as Jesus' accusers silently leave when pressed with Jesus' words, Harder's accusers are at first baffled by his willingness to hang a flag and engage them on proper respect for handling a flag, and then silenced when they could not sing more than 1 verse of a patriotic song. The flag utilizes paradox as a rhetorical resource. It serves as a mediating bridge between Anabaptist doctrine and American political values. It sidesteps difficult either-or identification questions. The flag also, I think, the flag story, I think, also underscores the importance of where to address the adversary in order to minimize conflict. Importantly, the mob encounter does not take place in the minister's church or the town square, but rather on the steps of his porch. In all likelihood, this minister would not have acquiesced to hanging a flag in his church, nor would the mob have retreated in silence, leaving the minister singing, had they been surrounded by onlookers in the town square. In all, the flag story plausibly entertains the idea that Mennonites can be pacifists and patriots, but in ways that gently yet subversively speak truth to power. The Mennonite World War I story is a crucible of faith and faithfulness. It is a nonconformist story, a subversive story, a story of identification. Even today, that sense of counterculture, I would even call it a rhetoric of mischief, is alive and well in our advertising campaigns. As this one says, ask some Mennonites to hitch up a horse and buggy, and you'll either have a confused horse or a very strange ride. If you think all Mennonites look, think, and live the same, you better think again. Ask this poor horse what we mean. He'll tell you all Mennonites are not alike. The Mennonite church is made up of all types and is open to all. To be a Mennonite, you just have to be committed to Jesus Christ and his people. It's as simple, as hard, and as complicated as that. You know us as the Mennonites, but do you really know us? This Sunday, take a face-to-face look at a church that may surprise you. The Mennonite Church. Our family can be your family. You see the normative disruption, the identification, the paradox of identification. This is what I study. Thank you for your attentiveness this evening and for supporting one of our 50 events to celebrate 50 fabulous years at Conrad Grebel.
Well, thank you. That was very engaging. Would you like to ask a question or two before we go and have a reception together? You can talk one-on-one, but comments, questions, stories, perhaps. One there.
Esther.
I'm curious where your sources are. I've never seen it.
Well, I look at lots of ads as part of my work in rhetoric. So this is part of Mennonite Media, which runs a service in the U.S., I think in Canada as well. So I get their materials, and their different ads. And this particular ad really intrigued me for the ways in which I think it plays upon, again, this disruption and subversion. But it did actually appear in Mennonite publications, in The Mennonite. I don't know about Mennonite World Review. Oh, and Jess, my husband, who knows these things more than I do about publications and ads, he says, too, it was set out to Mennonite churches to use in their own publications or put on bulletin boards. This ad isn't running here, or hasn't.
There was another comment. Brian, please.
Susan, I'm curious how your research fits within the larger sphere of your professional colleagues. Is it in any way subversive in and of itself in that larger sphere, or is it sort of well-accepted mainstream?
Yeah. It's fairly well accepted now. When I received my PhD in the late 1980s, my degree is in communication studies or rhetoric, but my particular sub-area was American public address. And most of my coursework was studying dead white presidents. But I did have a number of courses with some of the first rhetorical feminists and feminist scholars who were actually at the University of Kansas when I was there. And the University of Kansas has the oldest women's studies program west of the Mississippi. So I was also there at a good time when studying the early women's rights rhetors and studying these kinds of voices became much more common. Our Feminist and Women's Studies division within NCA is quite large now. Of the 700 members who are in the Public Address division, probably 400 of them are members of the Women's Division too. Social movement rhetoric has been strong for a long, long time. That really began in the 60s. So that part of the stories and the rhetorical investigation is even more common. The Mennonite picture is peculiar, is strange. There are not that many scholars, male or female, in rhetoric who are studying Mennonites and their rhetoric. There are exceptions, and in fact, one of my colleagues who's at Bluffton University, Gerald Mast, he and I have published together. There are others as well. Irv Stutzman has also published in Mennonite rhetoric. But that's a much smaller subset, for sure. And that was my dissertation topic. I did have one of the members of my committee at the prospectus meeting make me go over and over and over again why this was really significant. They were such a small group of people. I said 80,000 of them in World War I. That's not all that small. But those were some of the initial pushback questions. Yes.
Would there be times when you invite your students to be brazenly subversive in their gospel?
Yes, those who would be in an advanced public speaking or rhetorical criticism class, one of the things that we teach in the discipline of rhetoric and probably in literature too is that you can't subvert a genre well before you know the genre, right? So you first of all have to know how to give speeches that are inspirational and how to give speeches where you've got a problem and solution structure and know how to work within that before you can recognize when it is appropriate to subvert that form, so that you don't get beginning students who do something just absolutely crazy and then they come up and say, well, why didn't I get a good grade? I had people clapping and all of this stuff, and I said, well, it didn't meet the assignment. Okay? You first of all need to know how to meet the assignment in an intro class, but most certainly there are times when we want students, as they study the power of words and the ways in which words can help and harm, to use words creatively and subversively to get a message out that matters.
Would that include Muslim and Islamic students?
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm curious how the art of rhetoric works in the electronic world.
In the what world?
Electronic world, the world of the current.
It works wonderfully. And in fact, at one time I almost thought about moving this to the Great Hall because I wanted to show some excerpts. And of course that means getting on YouTube. You can do this on your own, but Google Bobby Kennedy's speech in Indianapolis. I mean, it is the most moving thing. And I couldn't show that here. When I teach civil rights rhetoric, I show lots and lots of clips from Martin Luther King. It, of course, doesn't work for the very early rhetors that I discuss, but I think it's wonderful. There's AmericanRhetoric.com is a website that has just an abundance of great speeches, and they're not all American. And so I think it's opened up a universe for our students to see and hear and look up close. And visual rhetoric is very much a part of the discipline of rhetoric as well. So I think it's been good. It raises all kinds of ethical questions. How well can you convey a message that's accurate and ethical and a few characters on a Twitter feed or not. I mean, the instant aspect of social media is ripe for investigation. Yeah.
The story you told about good, I appreciate because much support for studying humanity. Sort of imagine a politician getting up and quoting that.
I know, absolutely. And that's why you need to go hear it. I mean, he has this poem memorized. Of course, people used to memorize. I mean, even when I was in high school, we had to memorize the Gettysburg Address. Do you remember this, Byron?
Do I remember the Gettysburg Address?
I only say that because Byron and I went to the same high school, Newton High School, the railroaders. And kids don't memorize anymore. Poetry or speeches, we have. I actually have the Gettysburg Address in my rhetoric textbook, and from the time I first started teaching with it in one of the earlier editions, there was always a smattering of people who did raise their hands. Yes, we memorized that in grade 9. Now, no one. No, the last few times I've taught that not a single student had memorized the Gettys, and that's a short speech, 272 words. So it's a different era.
I'll ask you a question. I'll often ask Harold Mass a little bit of my time on the teeth, but I know Socrates thought of rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
What is the relationship between persuasion and truth?
If truth were self-evident, eloquence would not be necessary. And that's Cicero, and there's lots of debate between Plato and Aristotle. Of course, Plato, not a friend of rhetoric, thought that rhetoric was all sophistic discourse, so using lots of what we would call smoke and mirrors to shade the truth. There's debate there. But you go back to what the early students in Western culture first learned. It was the trivium, right? And rhetoric was one of those, rhetoric and philosophy. We fight these battles on academic campuses too. At both two other universities that I've been at, the philosophy department would sometimes want the credit that we all had in the speech departments and said, well, maybe they don't have to take public speaking, maybe they could take logic. And so then we would have debates on this. And we rhetoricians were a little better equipped. At least the two places I was at, the philosophers never won out on why logic was a good substitute for communication. And that's partly why I put this on the reading material. Why study rhetoric? We're always, I think, sometimes in the need of reminding people that rhetoric matters, not just because we're the storytelling creature, but because it does make a difference. Words are deeds. That's why I call my book The Rhetorical Act. It's not words or deeds. It's words as deeds.
Just wondering, would you say that in comparison to other times in history, is subversion alive and well in Mennonite culture today by your estimate?
Not by the examples that I shared here tonight. I think there's sort of an ebb and flow in ways in which protest works or doesn't work. I do think that we see some examples of Mennonites in the Christian peacemaker teams, a good example of the kind of subversive discourse and subversive actions that are being taken around the world, and young people who are part of Christian peacemaker teams. I've really enjoyed watching and listening that rhetoric. I would think that would be as close as what I have been presenting tonight. But there are other examples too, Mennonites who have been engaged in environmental peace. We see, I think, some good examples of subversive discourse there as well. In terms of protesting, taking part in First Nations struggles, joining the Idle No More movement, for instance, some interesting rhetorical tactics and protests that Mennonites have been a part of.
very much. Let's thank Susan again.
Oh, my pleasure. It was fun.